The moment I realized my dad chose his new family over me was when his seat was empty at my college graduation. I stood on the stage in my cap and gown, scanning the audience for my father's face as the dean read my name for summa cum laude honors. My mother was there in the third row, cheering loudly. My younger sister held up her phone recording the moment. My grandmother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, but the seat I'd reserved specifically for my father, the one with the best view that I'd paid extra to hold, sat empty. He'd promised he'd be there, sworn that nothing would keep him from watching me graduate at the top of my class after 4 years of relentless work. But his new wife's son had a baseball tournament that same day, and apparently that took precedence over his own daughter's college graduation. My name is Emma Hartley, and that moment on stage when I realized my father had chosen his stepson over me was the moment I decided I was done calling him Dad. Not out of spite or anger, though I felt both, but out of clarity. After years of being pushed aside for his new family, I finally understood that the father I'd known growing up was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as optional while his stepchildren were essential. My parents divorced when I was 13 and my sister Chloe was 10. It was relatively amicable as divorces go, no screaming matches or custody battles. My father moved out, got his own apartment, and we settled into a routine of seeing him every other weekend and Wednesday dinners. It wasn't what we'd had before, but it worked. Dad was attentive during our time together, asking about school and friends, helping with homework, taking us to movies and museums. For those first 2 years post-divorce, he remained present in our lives in meaningful ways. Then he met Diane at a work conference. She was recently divorced with 2 sons, Tyler, who was 15, and Mason, who was 12. Dad started dating her about 2.5 years after the divorce, and within 6 months they were engaged. The wedding happened quickly, and suddenly we had a new stepfamily that changed everything about our relationship with our father. At first, I tried to be understanding. Diane's sons had been through their own parental divorce, and I knew blended families required adjustment and compromise. But the compromises always seemed to flow in one direction. Our every other weekend visits started getting rescheduled because Tyler had football games or Mason had Boy Scout campouts. Wednesday dinners were moved because Diane preferred family dinners on Thursdays. Dad started missing my school events because they conflicted with his stepson's activities. The pattern became clear over my high school years. If Tyler had a football game and I had a debate tournament on the same day, Dad went to the football game. If Mason needed help with a science project and Chloe had a piano recital, Dad helped with the science project and missed the recital. His explanations were always couched in reasonable-sounding logic about logistics or prior commitments, but the underlying message was unmistakable. His stepchildren's needs outweighed his biological children's needs. Diane encouraged this, sometimes overtly. She'd make comments about how Tyler and Mason really needed a father figure since their own dad was unreliable, implying that Dad's attention to them was more important than maintaining his relationship with Chloe and me. She'd frame our disappointment as selfishness, asking why we couldn't be more understanding about the boys' needs. She positioned herself and her sons as Dad's priority family, while we were relegated to the periphery. My mother noticed and tried to shield us from the worst of it. She never badmouthed Dad directly, but she'd acknowledge our hurt and validate our feelings. She'd say things like, "Your father is making choices that may not be the best ones," or, "You have every right to feel disappointed." She picked up the slack when Dad canceled plans, but she couldn't fill the hole left by a father who was physically present but emotionally absent. By the time I started college, I learned not to expect much from Dad. I applied to schools, toured campuses, and made my decision with minimal input from him because he was too busy helping Tyler with his college applications. When I got accepted to my top choice with a partial academic scholarship, Dad's response was congratulations, followed by immediate questions about how much it would cost him in tuition since the scholarship didn't cover everything. We'd had a college fund that my parents had started when I was born. After the divorce, it was supposed to be protected for me and Chloe's education. But somewhere along the way, Dad had started dipping into it for Tyler's expenses. When I needed funds for my freshman year, I discovered the account had less than half of what it should have. Dad explained that Tyler had needed a new laptop for school and some other necessary items, and that he'd pay it back to the college fund, but he never did. I took out student loans to cover the gap, worked part-time during school, and spent my summers doing paid internships instead of coming home. The distance was partly practical and partly emotional protection. Being away at college meant I didn't have to watch Dad prioritize his stepfamily in real time. It meant I could build a life where his absences didn't hurt as much because I'd filled my time with friends and activities that didn't involve waiting for him to show up. Throughout college, I worked incredibly hard. I maintained a 3.95 GPA while juggling a part-time job and internships. I made Dean's List every semester. I earned leadership positions in 2 campus organizations. I was pursuing a degree in biomedical engineering, a challenging program that required dedication and countless hours of study. I was proud of what I'd accomplished, and more than anything, I wanted my father to be proud too. When graduation approached, I specifically called Dad to make sure he'd be there. I explained that I was graduating summa cum laude, that I'd be recognized on stage, that it was important to me that he attend. He assured me he'd be there, that he wouldn't miss it for the world, that he was proud of everything I'd accomplished. I believed him because I desperately wanted to. I should have known better when, 2 weeks before graduation, he called to ask about the date and time again. I repeated the information, and he said he'd already put it in his calendar but wanted to confirm. Then he casually mentioned that Mason had a big baseball tournament coming up and asked what day that was. My stomach dropped even before I told him it was the same weekend. I could hear the wheels turning in his head through the phone. He started with the setup, explaining how important this tournament was for Mason, how it was a regional championship and college scouts would be there. I interrupted to remind him that my college graduation was also a once-in-a-lifetime event. He said of course he knew that, but the graduation ceremony was hours long, and didn't he maybe just need to be there for the part where I walked? His words felt like a physical blow. I told him clearly that I needed him at the entire ceremony, that I'd reserved him a seat, that this mattered to me. He promised he'd figure it out, that he'd be there. I wanted to trust him but called my mother immediately after to prepare her that he might not show up. She was angry on my behalf and promised that regardless of what Dad did, she'd be there celebrating me with everything she had. The week before graduation, Dad called again. Mason's tournament schedule had been finalized, and the championship game was at the exact time of my graduation ceremony. He said he was in an impossible position, that he couldn't be in 2 places at once. I pointed out that he could absolutely choose to be at his daughter's college graduation. He said I was being unfair, that Mason was counting on him to be there, that Diane would be devastated if he missed supporting her son at such an important event. The conversation devolved quickly. I said Diane's feelings about her son's baseball game shouldn't outweigh my graduation. He said I was being selfish and not considering how hard this was for him. I said it wasn't hard. It was a choice, and he was choosing his stepson over his daughter. He said that wasn't fair, that he loved me and wanted to be there, but life was complicated with a blended family. I said life was only as complicated as he made it, and he was making a clear choice about whose life events mattered more. We ended the call without resolution. He didn't explicitly say he wasn't coming, but he didn't commit to being there either. I knew in my heart he'd choose the baseball game, but some naive part of me hoped I was wrong. I hoped that when it came down to it, he'd remember he was my father first, that our relationship predated his marriage to Diane by decades, that I'd been his daughter for 22 years and Tyler had been his stepson for barely 7. Graduation day arrived beautiful and sunny. My mother, grandmother, and Chloe met me at my apartment to help me get ready. We took photos. They gave me flowers, and Mom teared up talking about how proud she was of everything I'd accomplished. I checked my phone obsessively for a message from Dad saying he was on his way or running late or anything to indicate he was coming. Nothing. We arrived at the venue 2 hours early as required for graduates. I saw the empty seat I'd reserved for Dad and felt my chest tighten. My mother saw me looking and squeezed my hand without saying anything. We both knew he wasn't coming, but neither of us wanted to say it out loud yet. The ceremony started. The processional music played, and we walked in our caps and gowns to our seats. I looked at the audience again, a final desperate scan for my father's face. I saw my mother, grandmother, Chloe, and even some friends from campus who'd come to support me. But no Dad. When they called my name for summa cum laude recognition, I walked across the stage with a smile I didn't feel. My family cheered loudly, filling the space with their support, but it couldn't quite cover the dad-shaped hole in the moment. I'd imagined this so many times, pictured him in the audience beaming with pride, maybe even tearing up as I received my honors. The reality of his absence hurt worse than I'd anticipated. After the ceremony, during the reception, I finally checked my phone. There was a text from Dad sent about an hour before the ceremony started. "I'm so sorry, honey. Mason's game is running long and there's no way I'll make it in time. So proud of you. We'll celebrate soon." I stared at that message for a long time. Not, "I'm choosing to stay at the baseball game instead of coming to your graduation." Not, "I prioritized my stepson over you." Just a passive construction making it sound like circumstances beyond his control had prevented his attendance, when the truth was he'd made an active choice to watch a 14-year-old play baseball instead of watching his daughter graduate with top honors from a prestigious university. I didn't respond. I put my phone away and focused on celebrating with the people who'd actually shown up for me. My mother took me to an expensive dinner with Chloe and my grandmother. My friends threw me a small party that evening. I tried to enjoy it all, but the anger and hurt sat heavy in my chest. Dad called the next day while I was packing up my apartment. I let it go to voicemail. He called again that evening, and again the following morning. I finally answered on the fourth call, and his first words were asking why I'd been ignoring him. Not an apology for missing graduation, not an acknowledgement of how hurtful his absence had been, but a question about why I wasn't answering his calls. I said calmly that I'd needed some space to process my feelings about him missing my graduation. He immediately got defensive, saying he'd explained the situation, that he'd been torn between two important events, that I was making him feel guilty for something he couldn't control. I said he absolutely could have controlled it. He'd chosen to prioritize Mason's baseball over my graduation, and I was allowed to be hurt by that choice. He shifted tactics then, getting emotional and saying he felt terrible, that he'd wanted to be there, that it killed him to miss it. I didn't soften. I asked him directly why Mason's baseball tournament was more important than my college graduation. He said it wasn't more important, they were equally important, but Mason's event conflicted and he'd had to make an impossible choice. I said if they were equally important, he should have flipped a coin. Or better yet, he should have recognized that a college graduation, especially one with honors, was objectively more significant than one baseball game in a series of many that Mason would play. He said I was minimizing what was important to Mason. I said he'd been minimizing what was important to me for 7 years. That's when the conversation shifted and I said something I'd been thinking about for months. I told him I'd decided to stop calling him Dad. He could be David to me, the name everyone else used, because he'd stopped acting like a father and I was done pretending we had that relationship. He was shocked, said I was being dramatic and hurtful, that I was his daughter and he was my father regardless of what I called him. I explained that being a father was more than biology, it was about showing up, prioritizing your children, and being present in their lives. He'd stopped doing those things years ago, choosing instead to focus on being a stepfather to Tyler and Mason while giving me and Chloe the leftover scraps of his attention. I said the title of dad was one he had to earn through his actions, and his actions had shown me I wasn't a priority, so he didn't deserve the title anymore. He tried to argue, but I ended the call. Over the following weeks, he sent long texts explaining himself, saying I was misunderstanding the complexities of blended families, that he loved me just as much as he always had. I didn't engage. I'd said what I needed to say, and arguing further wouldn't change anything. My mother was supportive of my decision, though worried about how it would affect my relationship with Dad long-term. Chloe, now 18 and facing her own disappointments with Dad's prioritization of his stepsons, said she understood completely and was considering doing the same thing. My grandmother was blunt in her assessment, saying Dad had made his bed and now had to lie in it. The family dynamics shifted significantly after that. I didn't cut Dad out completely, but I created clear boundaries. I responded to his messages occasionally but briefly. When he suggested get-togethers, I evaluated them based on whether I actually wanted to spend time with him, not out of obligation. I stopped trying to make him see what he was doing wrong, accepting instead that he'd made his choice about which family to prioritize. Diane, unsurprisingly, didn't take well to my boundary setting. She called me disrespectful and said I was being cruel to my father during a difficult time. I pointed out that I was the one who'd had a difficult time watching my father systematically choose her children over his own for years. She said blended families required sacrifice from everyone. I said I'd sacrificed plenty, and now I was done sacrificing my self-respect by begging for basic paternal attention. The first time I referred to him as David instead of Dad in conversation was at a family friends gathering. Someone asked how my father was doing, and I said, "David's fine, I assume. We don't talk much anymore." The use of his first name was jarring to people who'd known us when I was young, but I didn't explain or apologize for it. It was simply the truth of our current relationship. Dad sent me an email after hearing about it from someone who'd been at the gathering. He said it hurt him deeply to hear me call him by his first name, that it felt like I was disowning him. I wrote back that I wasn't disowning him. I was simply being accurate about our relationship. He'd shown me through years of choices that being my father wasn't his priority, so I'd stopped treating him like he was mine. Over the next year, the distance between us grew. I got my first job in my field, moved to a new city, and started building my adult life. Dad wasn't involved in any of it in meaningful ways. He'd occasionally text to ask how I was, but the conversations were surface level and brief. Meanwhile, I saw on social media that he was deeply involved in Tyler's graduate school applications and Mason's high school activities, attending their events and posting proud parent updates about their achievements. The contrast was stark and painful, but it also validated my decision. I wasn't making up the favoritism or the neglect. It was documented in the attendance records, in the social media posts, in the allocation of his time and emotional energy. He was an active, involved parent to his stepsons while being a distant, occasional presence in his biological daughters' lives. Chloe eventually made her own decision to create distance from Dad. She'd had her own version of the graduation disappointment when he missed her high school graduation for one of Tyler's events. She was less confrontational than I'd been, simply pulling back and becoming less available. Dad seemed baffled by both of us setting boundaries, unable or unwilling to connect his absence from our lives to his choices about how he'd spent his time. About 18 months after my college graduation, I got engaged to my partner of 3 years. It was a joyful moment, and I called my mother immediately to share the news. She cried happy tears and started planning ways to help with wedding preparation. I debated whether to tell Dad at all, but eventually sent him a brief text. "Got engaged. Thought you should know." His response was effusive congratulations followed by questions about the wedding date and whether I'd set one yet. I said we hadn't finalized anything. He said to make sure I let him know the date well in advance so he could ensure he'd be there. The irony of that statement, given his graduation absence, wasn't lost on me. When we did start planning the wedding, I had a conversation with my partner about the father-daughter dance tradition. I said I didn't want one, that dancing with David would feel performative and false given our actual relationship. My partner supported whatever I decided, and we planned a wedding that reflected our values and our real relationships, not the ones we were supposed to have. Dad called when he found out from a relative that there wouldn't be a father-daughter dance. He was hurt and confused, asking why I was excluding him from this traditional moment. I explained gently but clearly that the father-daughter dance was meant to celebrate the bond between a father and daughter, and we didn't have that bond anymore. He'd spent years showing me I wasn't a priority, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise for a 3-minute dance at my wedding. He tried to argue that this was my chance to repair our relationship, that excluding him from the wedding traditions would damage things further. I pointed out that I wasn't excluding him from the wedding, he was invited as a guest, but I wasn't going to perform intimacy and connection we didn't actually have. If he wanted a relationship with me, it needed to be built on real presence and genuine priority over time, not manufactured for a wedding photo op. The wedding happened 6 months later. Dad attended, sitting with Diane and his stepsons. He looked uncomfortable and sad during the parts that traditionally involved fathers, but I felt at peace with my decisions. My mother walked me down the aisle, and during the reception we had a mother-daughter dance instead of a father-daughter one. It was perfect and authentic to our actual relationship. After the wedding, Dad made a few attempts to rebuild our relationship. He suggested monthly dinners, which I agreed to try. The first few were awkward, filled with surface conversation and long silences. He tried asking about my life, but years of distance meant he didn't know enough about my career or interests to ask meaningful questions. I'd become a stranger to him, and he to me. During one of these dinners, about a year after my wedding, Dad broke down crying. He said he'd made terrible mistakes, that he'd let Diane's insecurities and the boys' needs dictate his priorities, and he'd lost his daughters in the process. He said he didn't know how to fix it, but he wanted to try. It was the first time he'd taken clear responsibility without deflection or excuse. I appreciated the acknowledgement but was honest that I didn't know if our relationship could be repaired. Too much time had passed. Too many important moments had been missed. Too many times I'd been told through his actions that I didn't matter as much as his stepfamily. I said I was willing to continue the monthly dinners and see where things went, but I couldn't promise forgiveness or that things would ever go back to how they'd been. He asked if I'd ever call him Dad again. I said maybe, if he earned it back through consistent presence and genuine prioritization over time. But that would take years of him showing up, not months, and I wasn't going to give him the title back just because he wanted it. He'd have to demonstrate through sustained action that he understood what being a father actually meant. It's been 3 years since my college graduation now. Dad and I have maintained the monthly dinners, and slowly, incrementally, things have improved. He asks better questions about my life. He remembers details I've told him. He's met my friends and colleagues at events I've invited him to. He hasn't missed a birthday or a major milestone since that conversation. But I still call him David. Not out of spite anymore, but out of truth. We're rebuilding something, but it's not the father-daughter relationship we had when I was young. That was lost when he made years of choices to prioritize his stepfamily over his biological children. What we're building now is different, more honest, less assumed. Chloe is on her own journey with him, setting her own boundaries and making her own decisions about what relationship, if any, she wants to have. I support whatever she chooses while knowing her path doesn't have to mirror mine. My father skipped my graduation for his new wife's son's baseball game, and in that moment of absence, something broke that may never fully heal. I stopped calling him Dad not to punish him, but to honor the reality of what our relationship had become. Maybe someday, if he continues to show up and prioritize me consistently, I'll feel like calling him Dad again. But that's not today, and it may not be tomorrow. What I've learned is that titles have to be earned, especially the important ones. Being a father is about more than biology, it's about presence and priority and choice. David chose his stepsons over his daughters for years, and now he's living with the consequences of those choices. I'm not angry anymore, just clear-eyed about who he is and what our relationship actually consists of, stripped of the pretense and obligation that used to define it. And in that clarity, I've found peace.